Welcome, guys. Thanks very much for joining us this Sunday morning. So really excited to have, I think it's the second Zoom webinar as part of our player welfare series. And this one is a really important conversation. We feel like everyone is very, very keen to kind of find out as much information as they can. So this one's all about concussion. And obviously, sort of towards the end of last year when we were planning our Zoom series was when a lot of kind of international players started coming out and talking about the long-term impacts of concussion and some of the, I guess, the risks and the concerns around that. And so we felt as the Girls Rugby Club, we sort of have a pretty big responsibility really to kind of elevate the conversation and to try and provide a bit more awareness and education around that. You may have seen our player welfare survey, which went out over the past couple of weeks as well. So thank you if you filled that in. We've had almost 400 responses to that. So a really, really big response and some really interesting results actually. And just looking kind of at the early kind of findings, what we've found is that a lot of you have said that while kind of the risks are there and you're aware of them, that doesn't kind of outweigh your desire to continue to play rugby, which is really, really great to hear. But you're also really keen to kind of make sure that you're aware of what the risks are and what you can do to kind of help to reduce those. So that's why today we've got two really great people to kind of lead us on this Q&A about concussion. So I'll introduce those. So the first is Dr. Stephanie Adams. So Stephanie has a PhD in concussion education and an MSc in human cognitive neuropsychology from the University of Edinburgh. So her main areas of expertise are in sort of delivering educational program on concussion and physical activity for health. And she also leads the Concussed Research and Knowledge Exchange Group on concussion. So we've also got Peter Robertson. So Peter is a really well-known campaigner on concussion awareness and education. 10 years ago, he lost his son Ben at 14 years old to a brain injury caused by second impact syndrome during a rugby game. And since there, Peter's spent a lot of time sort of raising awareness of the risks and making sure that no one will sort of have to go through the same thing that he and his family have. So he's on the Scottish Concussion Advisory Board and works with Edinburgh University as well on concussion. So welcome, guys. Thanks very much for joining us. I think I might just throw to you, Stephanie, first of all, just to give us kind of a really brief sort of run through, I guess, of what you're doing at the moment, and I guess just to expand a little bit on what we sort of spoke about before. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much for having me. So my research focus is really on how do we work to change the culture of concussion through more effective educational approaches. I think there's been a lot of advancement and work to raise awareness, but at the end of the day, there's still opportunities for better approaches that improve attitudes as well as knowledge, because there's this really critical part of the whole cycle where we need to know more, but also how do we implement that knowledge effectively. So I'm really interested in understanding the cultural considerations and how we support each other. So I do that through research, but also I do that through actually delivering education and evaluating that with a variety of different groups. And that's what part of the work that falls under Concussed. So really thinking about better education approaches. And also through Concussed, which concussion is very multidisciplinary. So it means that we have parents involved, teachers involved, researchers, and medical professional. And it's not just a medical problem. We all have a role to play. So I know there's lots of great work happening around the UK, and we hope to sort of act as part of that through Concussed. So being a community to look at the evidence, because there's lots of work out there, but let's look at what's evidence-based and really evaluating that. So we work as a community as well to focus on that. So those are, I guess, that's the main gist of what we're focusing on at Edinburgh and Concussed.
Brilliant, thank you. And Peter, do you want to introduce yourself and what you're involved in?
Yeah, hi, I'm Peter Robertson, and I've been campaigning since 2011, since my son Ben, who was 14 years old, died from second impact syndrome playing rugby. And I suppose second impact syndrome, even the term, it was preventable. If the signs and symptoms had been recognized and Ben had been removed, he wouldn't have been able to get a second impact as such. And I suppose we realized, at Ben's inquest, we realized just what Steph was saying there, that we all have a role to play. There was so many opportunities for Ben to be removed from the pitch. His centre said he couldn't remember the last tackle. At one stage, he was on his hands and knees and had water poured over the back of his neck. And just so many opportunities. So, my other children still play contact sport. And a bit like we're saying, that this really isn't about putting you off playing contact sport. It's about don't mismanage the risk. And that's the biggest risk we have in rugby, is mismanaging it. And it really, just like I say, we all have a role to play, from parents, teachers, doctors, players themselves and coaches. And it's really making the playing environment as safe as possible. And, that somebody will see a sign and symptom of concussion and that player will be removed and they'll be safe.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, it's really important. I know we've got a lot of parents on here that, would be really interested to hear from you as well. So thanks very much for joining.
No worries.
Guys, what I will say, we've had a couple of questions through already to kind of kick us off. But if you do have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'll just keep an eye on the chat and ask them on your behalf as well. So look forward to seeing a lot of those kind of come through. So I guess, yeah, if we start off, the big one, how can you tell if you're concussed? Which may sound like a silly question, but we know a lot of concussions kind of go undetected as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll kick that off if we like, and Peter, you can jump in. So with concussion, there are a number of different signs and symptoms to be aware of, and there are different mechanisms of injury as well. And really, we take this approach, if in doubt, sit them out, recognize, remove. So it is a complex injury for a medical professional to diagnose. But what we know is, with concussion, is that there are a number of signs and symptoms. Some are physical, so they might be headache, for example. They might be cognitive, or how our brain processes information. So trouble concentrating, just sort of feeling a bit dazed, but they can also be emotional. So maybe someone acting out or more irritable than they normally would. So there's a variety of different signs and symptoms, and it's really about appreciating and knowing these and watching for them, and also being aware that they might come on immediately, but they can also take a number of hours or even a couple of days to manifest. So as Dr. James Robertson says, having an index of suspicion is really key. So having that awareness of signs and symptoms, and having an awareness of if there's maybe a funky tackle, or it doesn't have to be a direct hit, as we know, but having that index of suspicion and pairing that to see if there might be a potential concussion. But at the end of the day, regardless, if there's a potential concussion, we want that person to be taken out of play or practice, and recognizing also that every person is unique, and every concussion is different as well. So I might have a concussion this year and I respond in a certain way, and that might be different to one that I had a couple years later, because there are so many variables at play, and we really need to be aware of that.
And would you say as well that it's not only should you be aware of what that is within yourself, but also recognizing potential concussion in your teammates, for example, if they're playing alongside you and something doesn't look right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a really good point. So, in the question it says, how do you know if you've been concussed? But the you is there's also a we there as well. So athletes, need to be protective from themselves in many ways. And it might not be, as a person who's concussed, you're not perhaps in the best position to know that. So there is very much a team approach, and everybody involved really as well. Peter, did you want to add anything to that? I know you're...
Yeah, just on that note, I know Ben, he felt in a fog. He said, you know, dazed and in a fog, and he didn't actually know he was concussed. So that is the importance of teammates and just parents around the pitch, just saying, your Ben's mum knew something was wrong because she knew her son. She knew how he walked. She knew something was different. It was wee little small things. Another thing that the ref picked up on was Ben was known to be a bit of a cheeky chappy and giving cheek back to the ref, and he was quiet this match. You know, after the first injury, he was quiet, and he basically towed the line and done what he was told. It's subtle wee things. You know, kids looking at their hands because they can't focus, you know, and we realize that there's more chance of injury after a concussion because of just balance and just your vision. So yeah, sometimes it can be very subtle. You know, we know you don't have to be knocked out to be concussed. You know, only 10% of all concussions are knockouts. So yeah, we just need to be aware.
Okay, we've had a question in around, does wearing a scrum cap or a head guard actually help to prevent concussion? Is it worthwhile?
I'll take this one because after Ben's death, a well-known scrum cap manufacturer, I'm on Twitter, and they come on and said if Ben had been wearing a scrum cap, he would have survived. And they had to retract on that because we know scrum caps are good for cuts and abrasions and keeping your ears in the same place. But concussion-wise, they don't reduce concussions. We know in the American football, you see the helmet designs there. And, you know, hundreds and thousands, millions of pounds have been spent on headgear, and it doesn't reduce concussion. And the second thing about actually kids who buy headgear, or mums and dads that buy them for their kids, there's a change in behavior because it's Superman syndrome. They think they're safe, so they'll fly into rucks, and their behavior changes because they think they are safe. But yeah, I think it's knowing the limitations on wear the scrum caps, yes, but know the limitations on it, because there's always been a lot of call for mandatory headgear, you know, at youth level and things. But yeah, we need to know the limitations, and parents need to know that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the messaging around that type of equipment that's really key to look into and understand the limitations of the research as well.
What about, do we know anything about gum shields and whether or not that makes a difference, or is it a similar thing?
Similar thing. So yeah, the guidance, the takeaway is it's very similar. There's lots of research into this, so it is a sort of a buzz area of research, but the current evidence is that it doesn't prevent concussions.
Okay. Is it worse to get a concussion when you're younger, or are you more likely to get a concussion when you're younger? Is there any research around that?
That's a great question. I'll start this one off. So what we know is that so youth and adolescents are at a greater risk of getting concussion. They may also take longer to recover. And I guess what's really important to be aware of is that, you know, these are developing brains, and there's these, you know, there's lots of things going on throughout the body, and there's sort of different windows of development, and you know, we want to be responding to concussion as safely as possible and protect that developing body, because we, you know, there's risk of further injury, as Peter mentioned earlier. We know that if you play on with a concussion, which we shouldn't be doing, but if there's, you know, you're already injured, and your body's just not functioning properly, the battery's low, and you put yourself at risk of hurting other muscles and other injuries as well.
Okay. There's a question here around how do you get a message to the ref if you notice somebody in your team is concussed or on the other team is showing symptoms?
Just hand up and go over to them, get the match stopped. You know, we've seen in international matches where, you know, people standing over people who have been knocked out, protecting them from any injury. But if you call head injury, the ref should acknowledge that and stop the match. And the ref has the power to remove an injured player from continued playing, you know, because what we found was when you think about in the red mist of a match, the ref really should be the only neutral on the park. So we've had some coaches who have done what they consider like a mini HIA that we have in the elite and international game. And we don't have HIA in schools rugby or in the amateur game, but still some coaches think, I suppose it's, you know, monkey see, monkey do, and they replicate what they see on TV, and they do the Maddox questions and they do the finger test, but no one's trained in that. Maddox questions are to be used off the pitch once the player's been removed to see whether they need to go to hospital or not. But as we said, shouldn't be used as a filter to keep a player on. You could answer all 5 Maddox questions correctly and still have concussion. So I think it's like we said, there's a few of these myths and urban legends that go about, like scrum caps and you only have to be knocked out. And if you answer the Maddox correctly, you're okay to carry on. So it's bringing the attention to your coach or your referee and get the match stopped.
There's a question in here, should a CT scan be requested after a child is diagnosed with concussion?
So that's very much a question for the medical professional on the scene. But what we do know is that the evidence shows that CT scans don't tell the team about concussion. Might be another reason that a medical professional might ask for a CT scan to rule out something else perhaps, but in terms of what that tells them about a concussion, it's next to nothing.
Right, okay. Is it bad to sleep after you get a concussion? I know there's a lot of like information out there that you shouldn't fall asleep, or I know that's probably a tempting thing to do after you've had a concussion, is you just want to rest, but is there any truth to that?
Like, again, with that question, I think that's a really critical question to have with the medical professional on the scene, because every case is unique. There might be something else with that case to discuss. So in terms of a direct answer for that, I think I'd say that's for the medical professional who knows that person. What we do know is that when concussion is approached with recovery, the part of it, so the guidance suggests that for the first 24 to 48 hours, there's this focus on complete cognitive and physical rest. So reducing things like screen time, reducing stimulus, things like this. So rest is good in the main for the first little bit, but then we focus on what's called a graduated return to sport. And before that, a graduated return to normal and learn processes as well. So rest is part of that process, but sort of important to understand that case and have that chat with the doctor.
I think just on that note, with the Scottish concussion guidelines, our revised edition took into account that, because I think rest was seen as the main help in recovery, and now, like Steph says, they've changed that. Just like an injury, you come back slowly, graduated, because too much rest can actually cause major problems. So they've addressed that, and it's one thing I've noticed since 2011, that this is just evolving all the time. So the concussion guidelines every 4 years after the consensus group meet, they're updated. So we're in the process of updating the Scottish concussion guidelines now.
Okay. And I believe the head case work with rugby was also updated recently as well. And the messaging is fairly consistent, I believe.
Okay. This is a really interesting one, Peter, that you might know a little bit more about. How long after a head injury does the risk of second impact syndrome last?
It can be I'm not sure if you're aware of Rowan Stringer, who was over in Canada, 17-year-old, and she died of a similar, of second impact, same as Ben, but her case was slightly different. Ben's, all his injuries were on the one match, so the same timeline. Rowan had been playing rugby, picked up an injury, and actually gone home, and she'd actually Googled, concussion, and she looked that up, and then she had played again either a week later. So unless you are totally symptom-free, the second impact syndrome, your people talk about, oh, I've just got a small headache, a little headache, but that means you've got that symptom. That means things aren't okay. So we talk about you have to be totally symptom-free, before you can return to graduate or return normal life and then to sport. So yeah, that can be from minutes to hours to days to months, just that risk if your brain is still injured.
Yeah. Okay. This might be, again, one for more of a medical professional, but if we say the recovery in younger players is potentially longer than in adults, then should the return to play protocols be tailored for each age group?
Yeah, so certainly from at least the Scottish guidance document, which we can send a link to that after, and that could be a sort of a starting point for folk. But actually, that return to play protocol maps to that. So it's there's sort of different stages and steps of guidance, and with an adult, it says sort of 24 hours between each stage, if someone can progress. But with the younger populations, there's a longer sort of double that time, so it's sort of erring on the safe side. So yeah, there should be sort of tailoring and consideration for those under 18 or 19.
Yeah, for the guidelines for kids, it's 2 weeks rest and then 8-day graduated return. And so you're basically 3 weekends. That's what we worked it out. 3 matches, so 23 days. And that, I know with my youngest son, he had to go through it and it seemed like a lifetime for him. I was the worst dad in the world because I wouldn't let him play. But probably after his injury, he came about a week later and said, I understand, I appreciate it. But, you know, I think the things with youth, you know, they live in the moment, and to say 2 weeks away and that's 2 matches. But the big thing is to try and get into, if you're fully recovered, you'll have a longer playing career, you know, and it's the problems really occur when people come back too soon. Just like any other injury, if you do your ACL and you come back too soon, it could put you out of sport. So just with the brain injury, if you come back too soon, it's the same. It could end your sport. So 3 weeks isn't that long to deal with something when you think about it. You know, we've all had COVID, you're dealing with the COVID things, and we're used to information now. So it's just following the device that's there because it's there for a reason.
Yeah. We spoke about this a little bit before everyone joined the call. It's an interesting one for us at the Girls Rugby Club. Are girls more at risk of getting concussed than boys?
A good question. I think the data are sort of mixed on this. It depends a little bit on the study, it depends a little bit on the sport. There's some messaging to suggest that actually girls may take a bit longer to recover. There was a study actually that came out earlier this week, I think of Irish amateur rugby, and it had males and females. And actually the actual risk wasn't much different with concussion in that study. But I guess the point of this point is that there's actually a lack of female specific research, and we need to be doing more focus on that. I know there's some discussion around that perhaps actually part of the menstrual cycle might indicate or give clues to how a recovery might happen in the female in particular. And that's, I think there's a lot of hope with research there, because I know that there's lots of groups starting to look at that, which is really important.
I think on that note, not that I'm an expert, I have 2 older sisters and I have 2 younger daughters, but just reading up on it, it's really interesting that there was one female athlete talking about her symptoms during the menstrual cycle masks the symptoms of concussion. So she wasn't sure which was which. So there has to be, there needs to be a lot more done, because when you think all the research has come from America, you know, and on the back of the NFL, when I went down to Westminster, one of the meetings, you know, Chris Nowinski was there from America, and he was saying we're 6 years behind them. So we're really playing catch up, because we were just talking about the Scottish guidelines. It's addressed to all athletes, but that female part, we really need to work in that and get that there, because I think that's crucial.
Yeah. Are we at more risk of concussion heading back to rugby after having a lot of time off sort of over lockdown and, you know, not having that time sort of training and playing?
Yeah, I think knowing my son who's been off and playing football, there's that adrenaline rush to go out there and play and perform. And also you're with rugby, tackle technique. You know, technique's very important. So if you haven't been able to practice that, and just that wanting to get out there and you know, run over people, basically, you know, that pent up aggression is there. So you can see how, yeah, you can see how there might be more injuries. And we know if you've had a concussion, you're more of risk from lower injuries because your coordination and things. So it's not just from the brain side of things, you're actually more at risk from other injuries if you're not fully recovered from a brain injury.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're sort of also entering a bit of sort of unprecedented territory because it's one of the first times that there's been that much change in training cycles and game cycles. So I think it'll be really important to make sure that awareness is there for concussion, but also other injury as well. So just having that awareness that if we're not training and sort of there's been regression maybe of skills and you know, different things going on, to be really aware of that and mindful of it going into it.
Are there any things that you would recommend sort of incorporating into your training or potentially doing at home that would sort of help to reduce the risks? I know there's things like neck strengthening exercises or balance and those sorts of things, or?
So I'll take that question to start. So I will say that's definitely an area for someone who focuses on sort of strength and conditioning and injury prevention protocols, which isn't my space, but I do know that there are researchers looking into what types of maybe potential neuromuscular training programs might help, might be the thing, you know, where there's still a lot to look into, but I think that's something to watch for. But that doesn't, I think, even if those protocols are there, things need to be very specific. And if they're not implemented the same way that they were studied, it might not be as effective. So we need to be cautious with that and just remind ourselves that education is sort of that overarching part that complements these things. And we also need to keep our awareness up on that as well.
Yeah, because I think rugby has brought in Activate, you know, which is the exercise to go through before you actually play. And I've seen one of the messages there, neck strengthening, because they think that stops that whiplash effect. But again, a lot of it is, you know, it's being aware and out when you're in training, because a lot of these incidents will happen actually in the training park. Mm-hmm. And that's the biggest fear, when somebody doesn't admit or isn't picked up on, you know, on a Thursday night, and then they're going to play on a Saturday or Sunday. So it's, you know, I think World Rugby and even over to the football side of things, reducing the amount of contact and actually saving it for match day. You know, and a lot of people say, well, how do you practice technique then if you're not doing full contact? But it's reducing these repetitive hits that they know now are causing the damage.
Yeah. Do you know, I mean, is there any research around how many concussions, you know, you could have before you need to stop, or is it really individual?
I think in America, you know, they talked about 3 strikes and you're out. Mm-hmm. So for me, that when I was playing a month, you know, so when you think about it, but again, it's all very individual. You see people take tremendous force to the head and they're still walking about. And yet, depending on people's histories of concussions, I've just read an article there about, you know, basically people were sneezing. They'd had that many concussions, they would sneeze and they would get the symptoms return and things like that. So it's all very individual. Some people can take multiple hits and it doesn't affect them, and others, you know, what looks to be a pretty minor contact and they're out.
Yeah. It seems, I know Rachel's just put in the chat, it's the same here in the UK, 3 in a season could potentially rule you out. This is an interesting one here. What's the best way to join up information about what happens during school sport and club sport? Sometimes there could be a disconnect between the two. One coach potentially isn't aware of something that's happened outside of that environment.
Do you want to take that, Peter, as your role as coach?
Yeah, well, I sort of engaged with the local rugby club here, and that's what we realized, that there was sometimes a link missing in the safety chain as such between the communication between club and school. So they'd done a pro forma, and it was if you got injured, either school, then the the pro forma was sent to the club, and they signed it. So it was to keep everybody in the loop that this player, when date and time of when they were injured and what protocols and when they were due to come back. So yeah, it's keeping everybody in the loop, because that can be an issue at times where you're maybe playing for the school during the week and the club don't know that you've been injured, and then you're picked and you're playing. You have the pressure on you. Oh, I must turn up and play, but it's a conversation. Parents, I know in my case where some parents are like, they're away to the fitness class, and as the car pulls up, the kid rolls out and they drive on, and there's no communication between mums and dads and the coaches. So it's having that conversation, because a lot of clubs, you'll go in and you'll see all the stuff, head case, and you'll see it. And I would prefer to see that visually, that this club is doing something and they're not afraid to mention that, and the club's talking about it. Whereas some clubs have hidden it away because it's the bad side of rugby. But I'd rather see people acknowledge, and volunteer coaches and parents be as clued up as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And part of that might be sort of spreading that bit of information. So we're all on this call now, so maybe we go back and think about, okay, what actually happens at my club? What's that system like? Because protocols will be sort of different for different environments, but having a think about what that, as Peter said, that chain of sort of command or information is, because again, it's not just for the medical professional. We all can have a role in sort of helping to improve that communication, because communication is really critical of that.
Okay, I know we sort of touched on this earlier, but is the question around, does your being on your menstrual cycle have any greater risk? I know there's things about how potentially your balance could be impacted at certain stages of your cycle. Not sure if you guys sort of are prepared to answer that question, or is that something for perhaps a medical professional or someone else?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'd love to look into that further. But sort of my current understanding sort of stays at the fact that there is potentially something going on there. But I'd leave it to the researchers focused in that space. I think it's definitely something worth reading up more, because I know there might be some things going on with different progesterone phases and things like that. But that's probably where my end of the information goes at this stage.
If people are on Twitter, if they check my Twitter feed, an expert has covered that, and that's all. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, cool. Well, there is also, I mean, we spoke about it last week, if any of you were on the call with Kelly McNulty, but if you're tracking your cycle using an app, for example, like Fitter Woman, I know they do sometimes put in like little reminders and cues about how your hormones may be affecting you at different phases. And there are some in there around sort of balance and things like that. So maybe it's just a reminder to kind of be aware of your own cycle and track that, and just make notes of how you're feeling at different times. And if you are aware that sometimes you're a little bit more uneasy on your feet or whatever, then that's something that you can be aware of and just take extra precautions. Peter, what's your Twitter handle? We can put it in the chat for everyone to.
It's Ben Robertson at Peter Robertson 86.
There we go. All right, we'll put that in there at some point. I'll just jump on. I guess that's probably, we've been through a lot of the questions that have kind of come through, but Peter and Stephanie, is there anything else you think we might have missed, or that it's important to kind of cover this morning?
I suppose for me, it goes back to Ben's incident, a coach coming on and asking a concussed player, are you okay to play on? You should never hear that. That should be removed from the player's hands. A concussed player, brain injury, a brain impaired player will want to carry on. We see it on elite level, international level. You see it at schools level. Kids don't want to let their teammates down. So it has to be removed from their hands. Ben at one stage said, stop asking me stupid questions, just let me play, and he was laughing. So, that demeanor that people think, so yeah, when you hear a coach doing that, or if you see a coach with a finger doing that, the only time a coach should use his fingers to point to the sideline to remove them. They're not medically trained. You know, the RFU don't do any courses on spotting brain injuries. It's recognize and remove. If you suspect, you remove. That there is no test. And I think, again, Steph talked about culturally, and there's a culture of playing on through pain because we think we have to. But when you think about it, if you play on through pain, your body's a great way of telling you, if you're getting pain, something's wrong. The quicker you deal with it, the quicker you'll be back playing. So it's the same with your brain injury. When you remove safely and you deal with it correctly, you'll be back playing a lot sooner than if you don't deal with it correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Peter, you flagged this the other day. I think it was Dr. Katie Lister, who says culture eats protocol for breakfast. So, you know, that cultural part is so key. And the more and that takes time, that takes a long time to change, but we're seeing progress, but we need to keep pushing that message. So if in doubt, sit them out and recognize and remove.
I think we see that, especially, after international matches, and we see the red cards where, head contact, we're trying to reduce that and reduce the height of the tackle, and people are going, oh, the game's gone soft. I would like to see those people that say the game's gone soft playing an international game to see if it's gone soft. The weights, the speed, the size of these guys, strength and conditioning and nutrition, and the game going professional. People think that's just the elite level. We go to schools and we see the academies and their strength and conditioning. Ben was strength and conditioning for 3 years and he was 14, and nutrition advisory, protein shakes. So rugby players on average are bigger and faster. So the contacts and the collisions are bigger and greater. So yeah, for the rugby soft brigade, I think they're normally sitting in their armchair and they've never played.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know we've got a blog up on the Girls Rugby Club website from you, Stephanie, but if people are interested in finding out more about what the both of you are doing, is there anywhere they can go? I know, Peter, we've put your Twitter bio in the chat, but if there's anywhere else that we can direct people?
Yeah, so through the blog there's linked to the Twitter handle as well, and through certainly for myself with Concussed at Edinburgh, if people go to concussioneducation.co.uk, can help to either support or signpost other people, because as I said, there's sort of lots of people involved in concussion, and my focus is the education part, but we work alongside sort of the medical professionals, the physios, doctors, etc. So I'd be happy to support in that way.
Okay, brilliant. All right. Well, yeah, I think we've pretty much covered everyone's questions. So thank you so much for everyone that popped a question in the chat, and everyone that joined us this morning. Make sure you do head over to our website to find out a bit more information. And like Stephanie said, you can head over to concussioneducation.co.uk. Just a note as well, we'll soon be releasing the results of our player welfare survey, which I'm sure you'll all find really interesting. So keep an eye out on our social media handles and things, and yeah, we'll share those with you shortly. Otherwise, we'll let you all go away and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. So thanks very much again, Stephanie and Peter. Really appreciate you taking the time out this morning to have a chat with us.
Welcome. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
All right. See you guys.